we're here to talk about the ethics of the AI. Every technology that has ever been introduced has come with a moral panic. You know, is the sky going to fall? But we're also hearing that AI might be different in that it might be a tool that refuses to do some things in the way that a hammer wouldn't. So ethics may be more integrated to it. And we're also hearing that the level of existential threat is possibly only similar to the discourse we've had around nuclear weapons. So I'd like to ask you both, perhaps Audrey first, do you think this is a different ethical conversation to one we've had over and over again throughout history?
Thank you so much, and thank you for having us today. So I represent Mistral AI, which is a European company building AI models. I think the way we do it will answer a lot of your questions. The first thing is that we believe that we should build open source model. And actually, that answers one of your points about how do we put ethics at the center of what we do. As Leo just said, it's very important when we think about AI that we will not build models or use models under closed doors, because indeed it's a revolutionary technology. And none of us knows where it's going. But definitely being able to look at the way it works, to be able to allow researchers to look at the models, be able to allow governments, regulators, journalists to look at how it works is definitely something that is really important for us. And so when you think about ethics of AI, definitely it came really fast compared to other technological revolution, or at least change that we have seen in the past, and it's possibly the reason why it came so fast. It took us a long time to regulate social media, for example. So indeed, it's happening really quickly. But at the same time, indeed, the power of AI, and especially of generative AI, is really big. And we need to think about ethics at the building process, let's say ethics by design, to build models that will definitely be able to address those questions, the question of how do we cope the bias question, how do we think about privacy, how do we think about the impact of what we are doing, but also how we work with the application work and all the ecosystem working with our models.
Theodoros, same conversation again or something slightly different?
A lot of yes and no is the answer, of course. Just a clarification. I love the type of co-founder in INSEAD. I'm not a co-founder of INSEAD. I'm a co-founder of Tremo, but that's a clarification. So I'm here with both hats, INSEAD and Tremo, being the startup I co-founded in the space. So first of all, every technology comes with change. Social change, organizational change, geopolitical change, military change, you name it. And of course, change means there are moral dilemmas. There is potentially redistribution of something. And redistribution has, of course, ethical implications behind it. So in that sense, it's the same as any technology. And of course, the bigger the impact on change the technology has, the more. Second, to your nuclear question, nuclear came with kind of little change in a sense, in some sense, right? Because it was not social change directly. It was social change in the sense of geopolitics and political decisions, and of course how people were moving east and west, and how peace was maintained in a counterintuitive way, also because of nuclear, because otherwise the stakes were high. But at the same time, it's different from AI, and AI is different from everything else in a couple of things. To begin with, from nuclear, it's all about the governance. Well, nuclear is all about pressing a button in a sense. Pressing a button. Of course, the whole process of setting a button, there's a whole governance that puts kind of limits on who can press the button when. There's a very strict governance, also at the global level, about nuclear proliferation or not. While in AI, first of all, it's not about pressing a button. It's about many other ways it can impact us, in addition to traditional ways technology changed the world. If there is one fundamental difference between AI and everything else that we developed in history before, is that AI has the ability to take increasingly complex decisions, or at least impact decisions. if not take them automatically. And with decision-making comes dilemmas, come trade-offs, come responsibilities, come accountabilities. That's something we didn't have to worry about with other technologies because they were not taking decisions. Yes, we had autopilots in planes, but let's say AI takes a lot more complex decisions and with a lot more trade-offs. So this is a fundamental difference from anything we developed before, decision-making or impact. But also information impact. It impacts how we understand the world. So it has other effects through how it impacts us, because we converse with AI. Therefore, it has an impact on our mental model of how the world is, which therefore affects our decisions, from voting to buying to healthcare to everything. So in that sense, it's very different. However, just to close, much like for nuclear, to find a similarity at least, if there is any, well, there is one similarity, not in the technology, but in how we govern the technology. It took a long time, and the same with the internet, by the way. The internet, I mean, it's been 20 years that now we are taking into account the kind of damage we made with online trust and safety challenges. So much like the nuclear, much like the internet, much like healthcare, much like drugs, pharmaceutical drugs, there is a whole, the same for AI, there is a whole governance structure you have to put in place at the corporate level, at the project level to begin with, product level, right? The safety by design or ethics by design, at the product development level, at the corporate level, at the national level, at the regional level, if you should, Europe, and of course at the international level, which is going to be a big challenge.
If I made a lot of levels for startup to compete in this big world. So there's also a question of how do we simplify the government and the regulation to make sure that any kind of companies can actually compete in this very competitive industry, and having a global governance and trying to find rules that would apply everywhere in the world will allow us to adjust to the entire world and to compete with big tech to be quite straightforward?
Well, let's think about that kind of global aspect there. The marketplace could be summarized as USA and China and Europe as the three big players, and they all have different value systems and different approaches to things like regulation. We've just heard about the risk of kind of forum shopping and setting yourself up where you are least regulated. One could oversimplify and try and claim it's regulation versus innovation, but part of innovation is driven by the ability to commercialize and draw a commercial benefit from, and that can be affected by the deployment of proprietary technologies and open source. So thinking about that ecosystem of what drives innovation and how innovation could be building in governance and who should be making those choices, where do you think that should be driven from? Theodoros.
So first of all, let's be clear. Two things. It's not necessarily regulation versus innovation. It can be regulation for innovation. Classic example and the main simple argument to anybody who is against regulation is the following. Would you be willing to put your money in a bank which is unregulated? Is there a market which is unregulated? There is no such thing. The financial sector has been heavily regulated. The same with healthcare, of course. And in fact, trust. Trust is fundamental for innovation and adoption of new innovations. And trust also is supported by regulation. That's the first point and relates to innovation. Second point is that there is no perfect regulation. There is continuously improving regulation. What I love most about the EU AI Act is something that almost nobody talks about. I pay personally little attention on all these high risk, low risk and requirements. That's okay, good, but basic stuff. To me, the most important part of the EU AI Act is how they thought about the governance and the continuous improvement of the regulation over time. That is the most important part of the EU AI Act. Everything else is details because they will change. So it's about basically continuous improvement continuous improvement. Now, a little bit on, you mentioned about China, Europe, US. I must say we should also pay a very close attention not to leave in quotes, the rest of the world behind, and the rest of the world, of course, is not behind. For example, the UAE is probably ahead of Europe, and so is Israel, and so are potentially other areas, Canada included, of course. So there are areas which are actually potentially a lot more innovative. UAE has Falcon with an open source kind of ecosystem they built there. They put a lot of money on the open source ecosystem. We are working on a project on that. Let's see how that works out. Open source is a different discussion. I mean, Mistral is playing that quite strong. It's not black and white. It's not very easy. There's lots of issues here around accountability, et cetera, et cetera. But all to say, just to go back to your questions, we have to regulate in order to innovate and adopt.
Audrey.
Yeah, I quite agree. I'm sorry about that. No, definitely regulation, it depends of where you put the regulation. We believe that definitely if you regulate the technology, then you can harm a bit the innovation, because definitely it's moving fast and we don't know what will be the next models. But it's important indeed to build trust, to regulate properly and to regulate the application and how you use the model. And to that extent, the AI Act that the European Union has voted is interesting in terms of regulating by the risk and looking at what kind of risk in which circumstances you will use an AI model, what is the risk coming from that? Is it a high risk? Is it an existential risk, etc.? And coming from that, you will put a different kind of regulation with different thresholds. That's very interesting in terms of the approach, and it will allow companies to innovate as well.
So if we think a little bit about where the ethics are most being questioned, I think very high up on a lot of legislators' lists is misinformation, particularly around radicalization, around deepfake technology, and about interference with democratic discourse and democratic processes. I have an interesting take on this, being both British and European. The Brexit Leave campaign made quite a lot of use of data science and nudge technologies to serve adverts to prompt a particular behavior, and that may well have been, it was a very narrow win. That might have been critical. So when you're thinking about these technologies, and these, prohibition doesn't necessarily prevent technology that already exists being deployed, what other than prohibition can be done to protect our key democratic processes and these other high point topics? Theodoros, you're smiling at me.
Wow, that's a very difficult question, because as we know very well, it's a very political question. First of all, let's make a distinction between misinformation and disinformation. I'll leave it there for now, but one is different from the other. It's intention versus not intention. Second of all, managing disinformation or misinformation, even more so misinformation, actually can hurt democratic processes, because the boundary is always gray, of course, right? So it's not just misinformation is bad for democracy, it's also managing misinformation badly is bad for democracy. There is a US Supreme Court case going on. Last week it was a hearing in the Supreme Court. It was a case called Missouri versus Biden. Now it's called Murphy versus Missouri. It's about potential intervention of the government of Biden to online platforms, you were there at the time, regarding removal of content. And the question, what's the process? And that's why it's in the Supreme Court of the US last weekend. It's under hearing. So it's not this or the other. What I will emphasize on, and by the way, this is a topic that it's exactly the number one thing we focus on. We focus on two things in TREMO. One is the topic of online trust and safety, which includes this, and the other is AI safety and responsibility. And on the online trust and safety and misinformation point, the main idea, in my opinion, here is not what to remove, but how to remove it. It's about fair process. It's not about the outcome. It's a little bit like back to philosophy, procedural justice versus distributive justice. We care a lot more about procedural justice. And what I personally love a lot is another regulation in Europe, the Digital Services Act. Of course, we can criticize it about whether it's implementable, lots of question marks, but at least it's built on a fundamental principle, which is fair process, meaning transparency, what is removed, why is it removed, did people complain, involvement, and right to appeal. Those three things are fundamental for fair process, and we should make sure that there is fair process in everything we do, because there is no other way to make, let's say, long-term sustainable decisions in these very gray zones.
Yeah, I think there's several points to get in mind when we talk about disinformation. The first one is definitely we need to separate AI that produce text from AI that produce video and photos. The impact of the disinformation is definitely not the same when you are looking at images that looks real and that you have no way to distinguish whether it's real or not. When you are working with text, and we're a text-to-text company, the question is slightly different because, I mean, I think there's enough creativity within the world to have produced misinformation before the ray of Gen AI. And so when we talk about text-to-text disinformation, the issue for us is more on the bottleneck of social media and how it will be distributed. So there's definitely a need to create cooperation and work between a social media company and AI models company to make sure that we have a strong cooperation, and we are helping them to identify a text-to-text generation of disinformation, to flag it and be able to put the correct remediation. And I agree with you that censorship is not always the right remediation when we talk about disinformation. When we talk about image and deepfake, again, we're not producing that, so I only have a view that is not related to what we do. But indeed, there's lots of discussion around should we watermark, should we put label on those type of content. We could, definitely we could, and it's not that difficult to put watermarking on image. But again, think about who are the bad actors, who are the people we are trying to share this kind of content and produce this kind of content. Will they comply with watermarking? I'm not sure they will. So there's a question of how it will impact population and citizen if at some point you say every content that has been created by an AI will be watermarked, and at some point you see something that has not this watermarked, and then it has been produced by bad actors. So there's a real discussion to have about where do you put, what is the right solution to inform citizens. And I think a huge part of this debate, and it was exactly the same debate 5 years ago with social media, is how do we work on AI literacy? How do we engage in pedagogy about how the AI work? How do we teach people to use our tools properly and to look at them and their output properly? And this is a collective work from obviously the industry, but also we at UNESCO, and they are really engaged in this type of literacy process, but governments and any kind of NGOs, obviously.
Yes, I have a little boy in school, and I was delighted to hear that he is being taught kind of to deploy critical thinking skills to things he sees on the internet. I think it's part of education at every level now. Obviously, I'm a lawyer. You mentioned some legislation, so that got me excited. The Digital Services Act in the EU takes, as you say, a procedural approach that challenges need to be dealt with promptly and effectively. The UK's approach with its Online Safety Act is slightly different, and it's giving positive duties to moderate content onto providers. Which of those do you think is better, having an agile response or a responsibility on deployers of AI to monitor them internally? Theo first.
Good question, and I don't know the details of the OSA, I must say. I mean, I followed it quite a bit, but I don't know the details a bit, so I cannot say much about this. Again, I mean, if there is one sentence to say which covers, it's a blanket sentence, I'm sorry I'm going to say a blanket sentence, is that ethics is about trade-offs, and that's a challenge. So any dilemma you put, innovation, regulation, agility, strong hand, it should not be like this or that. It should be about this and that with a needle being left and right. And by the way, the needle will be moving, much like it has been moving for regulations in other sectors. Look at the financial sector. The regulations there have been strict, not strict, then financial crisis, strict again, and then maybe less strict now. So it's all about the process of how to find the balance in a continuous way, back to what I mentioned in the first question. So yeah, I'm sorry, probably I'm not answering your question other than just giving you a blanket answer that it's about the trade-off. You have to manage the process.
Audrey.
I think as well that when we talk about this regulation and content moderation, that's what the DSA is planning, that's a very key point also about AI. We should not reinvent the wheel for any type of regulation. I mean, we do have in Europe GDPR that applies to what we do. We do have DSA that will have an impact on content that has been produced by AI. About the question of who is liable for the content prediction? I think it's a huge question, and it's not really clear so far. But think about the AI model as the engine of your car. So if you have a car, you put the engine into it, and you are driving too fast, who is responsible? The engine producer or the driver of the car? Probably there's something in the middle when you talk about AI, because if there's bias in the model, it will impact the results. But again, when you are asking the models to produce a task, you also have a responsibility into your request. And that's also really important when you talk about ethic. There's ethic at the model level, but there's also ethic at the prompt level. The prompt being when someone is requesting the model to perform something. And that's also important for us as model producer to look at what people can have the model to perform or not, and to think with governments and regulators and NGOs and the civil society about what we can allow people to request the model to be performed or not. That being said, there's many potential for people who are trying hard to push that beyond our guardrails, but at least we can, then it will mean that there's a true intent first, and then at least we have tried to prevent these bad behaviors.
Yes, in the US, we would hear guns don't kill people, people kill people, wouldn't we? So we talked a little bit about the internet. It was originally a military technology. It was about distributed communications to make it harder to take out a communications chain. So the concept of AI-engineered cyber warfare, when critical infrastructure is online, power stations and so on, is the only line of defense going to be AI cybersecurity? And are we going to end up with some sort of cyber evolutionary arms race? Theo.
First of all, I love you put your finger on the critical infrastructure and cyber security. There is a whole term coming up sometimes called safety tech, which includes cyber security, but also AI security and a bunch of others. Content moderation is part of that, because about security in the democratic or whatever political system. In the West is democracy, in China is a different political system, which is at stake potentially. We cannot just say democracy, because that excludes some people, right? Of course, we have to pay attention to all those things, even though that's our values, of course, here. So back to your question, there is a term that comes out again and again, and increasingly more so in discussions around AI, national security. It's almost impossible nowadays to be in a conversation around AI regulations, AI competition, AI laws, AI innovations, without discussing about national security. It's almost in every single discussion, at least in some discussions. This, of course, national security has multiple aspects. You mentioned military. AI has, by nature, the dual-use characteristic, civilian and military uses for almost every single application you can think of. What we do at Remo can have a military implication about information gathering or control potentially, the same what you do over there at Mistral, almost everything. It's almost impossible to avoid this dual-use nature of AI, which makes it challenging, right? So in that sense, we have to pay attention to this, but at the same time, there is national security implications around critical infrastructure from the hardware, I mean, cables in the Red Sea or whatever being cut, right, potentially, or whatever else, which is internet cables, to data poisoning, model poisoning. These are terms that, for example, the US National Security, how it was called, National Security Commission on AI. The US National Security Commission on AI, which came up with a report about 2 years ago, identified this, plus data poisoning, plus model poisoning, plus bioviruses innovation, plus disinformation as some of the core national security challenges of AI for the US, and of course that's for everything. So it's important to talk about this.
We're short on time. Audrey, do you want to give any comment to that? No. Okay, well, just before we run out of time then, where do you think the next surprise is coming from? It's coming really fast. We're at a sustainability conference. Is there any emerging use case where you see AI impacting on sustainability and welfare of the planet?
I think there's many use cases, and I think the first challenge that we definitely should address is how do we make sure that this technology is available everywhere for everybody? And I'm thinking about not Occidental world. And that's definitely going with how we train on different languages than English, and how do we make sure that the entire world can benefit from this revolution. But also, I mean, we've talked about what was not going well with AI, but there's also many, many potential with AI to increase knowledge about everything to everybody, but as well to move faster in the research world. For example, I don't know if you saw this news, but an AI has found a new material to create battery that is not lithium, and this is a research that would have taken 10 or 15 years, and thanks to AI, it was able to push new boundaries of how do we produce more sustainable solutions. And it's the same with bias. I heard Leo's presentation, and obviously the AI will reproduce the bias that it has seen in the data set and in all the content we have all produced during the last millenniums. But at the same time, this is a tool that is working on mathematics. If we teach the tool how to be removed from all the bias we have found, and we use a tool to actually help us take decisions without our own human bias, then we can as well solve some problems.
Yeah, I think there's something slightly self-serving about the AI making access to its power source easier. But Theodoros, any thoughts on?
Well, I'm hoping and waiting for the AI scientist, which you allude to. I think that's the next big frontier, AI that does science, AI that trains AI and improves continuously, the way AlphaGo 2 did for Go, for the game of Go, and eventually doing science. Because if there is one thing that has been moving the needle of civilization, has always been science and technology. And if there is one thing that keeps civilization on tracks, is governance. So I'll close with a distinction. We wrote a number of articles at INSEAD Knowledge. I encourage you to go take a look at this. INSEAD Knowledge, you can find them under my name also, the articles, where it's a series which we call it Good Tech. Not only tech for good, but also good tech around governance and everything else we discussed. So we have to do both, tech for good and good tech.
If you could put your hands together for all of our speakers, please. Thanks very much.